Chess has so many different ideas, so many different patterns, that it's really not possible to talk about all of them. So today, what I thought is, I picked a few endgame themes that I think are practical that you should know, and just consider it a sort of, a collection of ideas, not just one particular theme. Let's start with this position. Okay, so after the game went on, and as typical in a game, things happen, trades happen, and between two strong grandmasters, endgames often occur because no knockout blow was either found or was available during the middle game. So quite often, the best players in the world are eking out victories in the end game because they have to, right? They have I have this one little thing that's better than yours, or that this one little thing that's good in my position that maybe just a little bit better, and I can put the pressure on your opponent. Okay, so survey the position. I'll give you just a minute to survey the position. It is white to move. So it's Rublevsky to move. Let's talk about what's happening. So you guys already identified that these two pawns, albeit doubled, don't hurt black as much as usual because they still stop these pawns from creating a passed pawn. So really, when we're looking at this, we can see that black has an immediate threat against this pawn. And black has a 3-on-2 pawn majority in the center, but because of the way they're constructed in this sort of reversed phalanx here, it's hard for black to break through here because the pawns they're not very well placed to break through the position. The only way that black would be able to break through and create a passed pawn here would be to play the move pawn to d4, and then followed by pawn to e3 and pawn to c3. That's how black could create a breakthrough. But as far as the way these pawns are currently placed, they're not very well placed to be able to advance. They're sort of fixed and stuck. So the one nuisance, though, is that Kasparov is attacking the a-pawn with his rook. And that's annoying, because what black would like to do, and sort of what white would like to do, is bring the king to the middle. Sorry, I can't draw an arrow as I wish. It only allows me to draw straight lines. So bring the king to the middle and then mobilize the majority. For white wants to bring the king to the middle and not to mobilize the majority, but to attack these weak pawns. If you had to play a move, what would you play? White to play. If you had to play a move, what would you play? Now I'm going to show you what Rublevsky played, and to me, this is what wins him the game. This is an exclam move. If I'm giving this move an exclam, that's boom, great move. Rublevsky played king f2 because he's not a material girl. So king f2, he recognizes that if he has to play rook to a1 or rook to b2, that gives black time to get his king to the e5 square. Sometimes your move is determined by what your opponent's going to do. This is not the most important pawn in the position. It's actually the d-pawn. If we could eliminate the d-pawn, then these two would fall as well. All we have to do is ensure that we don't lose our 7th rank. And so Kasparov took the pawn. He said, Kasparov, you can have this pawn on a2. Go, there you go. It's all yours, baby. But I'm getting my king to the middle, and now I am going to try to round up your pawns in the center. And my king can start picking them off as well. Well, Kasparov said, well, I better bring my king to the middle. Rublevsky checked. He said, well, you want to give me these pawns over here? I'll happily take those, because if I can get these, I'll have 2 runners here. You will have a 3-on-2 majority here, but the lack of flexibility in black's pawn structure hurts black in this endgame. So Kasparov played king f6. Rublevsky checked. He moved back and then played rook to d6. Black can't afford to lose this pawn. If he loses the base of this chain, right, of the base of the protection of these pawns, black will easily lose the game. So Kasparov played rook to a5, guarding the base point. Rublevsky played h4 to not allow any of the kingside pawns to move, not offering black any pawn play at all within the position. And, it's not a surprise that at this point, white is down a pawn, but white actually has the much better position here, and that's due to the activity of the king and the activity of the rook. So rook is very active, targeting 2 points of interest. This pawn on h4 stops the pawn from really advancing off of a target point here. So g5 was played by Kasparov anyway, but I don't know what to recommend. Let's say Kasparov just waits, right? So let's say Rublevsky waits, or by advancing and push the pawn. Okay, so Kasparov waits. Rublevsky, let's say he could go here. He could bring his king in. He's got all the ideas here, and the idea is just to start attacking these pawns. And black is pretty hopeless within the position. He can't really do it. It's a helpless position for him. Okay, so g5 was played by Kasparov. Rublevsky took, and Kasparov's point was, I'm giving you the pawn back, but now your pawns are also messed up, and I'll play king to e7. Rublevsky played rook to c6, and the reason is he wants to keep the king cut off. He still has ideas of bringing the king up. Rook to a1, king into d4, rook to d1, attacking the pawn from behind. King takes d5. Of course, if you take this pawn, king takes e4, rook takes, and then king f5. And again, it's white who's calling the shots here. I'm threatening this pawn, I'm threatening check, and I'm threatening king to g6, coming in and grabbing this pawn. So everything is crumbling for black in this position. This pawn is under fire, the king is coming in front of the pawn to attack that, and then there's another, white is winning material here. So king to d4, rook to d1, king takes d5, e3 is what Kasparov played. He's trying to liquidate as many of the pawns as possible, because that is oftentimes your best defensive mechanism in a rook endgame, is trade off a lot of the pawns. And if you find yourself down 1 pawn in a rook endgame, you have a high chance of drawing the game if your king is well placed. And black's king is not poorly placed in stopping this pawn. You know what black's biggest problem is right now? There's still these kingside pawns. If there weren't the kingside pawns, black could salvage this game. But black has to worry about this pawn prancing down, but he has to also make sure that he doesn't lose the g-pawn. Okay, Rublevsky played rook to e5, king to d6 was played, rook a5. So he's cutting off the king, but he's also guarding his pawn. Rook g4, king hides, rook to g1. Kasparov's just, again, staying tethered to the pawn so that the rook has to remain there. King to b4, strong move by Kasparov. By Rublevsky. The idea is to block the check with the pawn now and slowly make progress with the extra pawn. Check by Kasparov. King gets in front. King to e6, check, and g6. And Kasparov recognized that this is trouble, because after rook to g1, black can't ever take this pawn. Because if black plays rook takes pawn, white trades, black trades, and white's pawn's going to be faster to promotion because not only is black's pawn in its starting position, but the king would also be blocking it in that position. So king to b5 was played. Idea is to free the pawn to move. King e5, c4, check, king c6, and king to d7, and that's all she wrote. This pawn is coming home. Yep. And here, and I don't want to dwell on the position too much because we have other games to see, but here Kasparov resigned because rook f7, king takes pawn, and this pawn promotes now is the issue. So Kasparov resigned. Now, what do I want you to take away from this game? I don't really want you to take away the endgame technique in its entirety, although if you could play like Rublevsky played this endgame, that would be fantastic. There was a sort of critical moment where you had to make a decision, and most of you wouldn't have made the correct decision. Most of you in this position were not thinking about playing the move king to f2. Most of you. I know some of you were, but most of you. And most of you thought, okay, like either counterattack or rook to b1 or rook to a1, guarding the a pawn, and then deciding what you want to do. But the reason I showed you this game is I want to change your mind, right? I'm not making you better by showing you stuff you already know. So I sort of had a feeling that the majority of the chat would play rook to b2 or rook to a1. Rook to a1, putting the rook behind the pawn because that's sort of a rule in chess, and then rook to b2 just simply guarding the 7th rank to bring the king in. But the reason I wanted to show you this is because not only is king f2 the best human move, it's also the best computer move. And it just speaks to the fact that in the endgame, if you can choose an active move over a passive move, you should certainly do that. This is, as you can see, a game of two legendary players of the past, Jose Raul Capablanca, grandmaster, of course, and a world champion, versus Tartakower. And so we got this position, and white's thinking, okay, what do I do here? So what are your thoughts initially? Don't give me a move. Don't tell me a move. It is white to play, but don't tell me a move before you tell me some of the characteristics on the board. Capablanca, so everything you guys said is totally relevant in the position. Bishop versus knight, the majorities, the respective majorities. I agree with Constantino that you need to improve the placement of the knight here, the black knight. But, okay, so bishop versus knight, majority on the king side for white, majority on the queen side for black. So black would be looking to advance, create a passed pawn on the queen side. White would be looking to gain activity using the majority on the king side. Well, Capablanca doesn't waste any time. So if he checks on e1, Tartakower would just block the check. Okay, and they have share of the file. You could consider the move rook to e5, but I don't like the move rook to e5 because I'm not sure I want to go into this endgame with these pawns weak and fixed like this. The knight can hop around and start to attack them. I'm not very confident with that. So I don't want to trade rooks. I love the move h5 more than anything, and that's indeed what Capablanca played. h5 is such a beautiful move. So h5 hits all of the important notes that you guys told me about the position. It uses the majority to open a different flank. Okay? So use of the majority. It opens up the bishop. You guys said the bishop was a little bit blocked in. So h5 takes a crack at the king side pawns. and opens up the scope of this bishop. On top of that, because the rook, the only open file, and rooks need open files to operate, the only open file can be evenly challenged by the defender. White wants to create a new file for the rook, one that black cannot oppose. So h5 is a temporary pawn sacrifice which opens up an avenue for the rook. So h5 was a fantastic move. And so, like, just to show the idea, if pawn takes, rook h1, and the rook is infiltrated, that pawn, you're getting that pawn back, and then on top of that, you're also, you're attacking black's weaknesses as well. So rook f6 was played by Tartakower. He's trying to hold the position together. Kappa takes. Of course, Tartakower takes back and plays rook to h1. So king f8 was played. The rook infiltrates to the 7th rank. Very, very, very powerful move. Rook to c6 was played, and this is what Reddy was talking about. White should not be overly concerned about the weaknesses on the queen side because he is controlling the 7th rank, and if he could capture here, he's going to have 2 connected pass pawns on the king side. In addition, he's going to be slicing off the king. So here we go. I'm going to read you Richard Reddy's note to Capablanca's next move, but I'm not going to show you Capablanca's next move. You're going to figure it out, okay? Here's Richard Reddy's note to the game. He says, anxious nature might have moved the king toward the queen side, but Capablanca adheres to the principle of aggression that governs rook endgames. You need to use your majority. So that's exactly what happens, guys. He went g4. Good move. And the point is, if you take this pawn, I take on g6, and the move g4 helps me because I want these pawns to come running up. So White was saying, listen, I'm going to push my pawns forward. You attacked my pawns. Say A, say B. You attacked my pawn. I'm not going to defend it. You take here, I take here, and my pawn's one step closer to the promised land. I'm doing what I need to do. So knight to c4 was played. g5 was played by Capablanca. And again, he's fixing this weakness, and the next thing he intends to do is bring his king in. So here's what Reddy says about this particular moment. He gives his opponent the opportunity to win the a-pawn. But Capablanca has confidence in the passed pawn which he obtains. Okay, so we're going to see that happen. Knight e3 check, king f3, knight to f5. And again, this pawn is still hanging, but bishop takes, g takes, and finally, what move did white play here, which is once again the right call? Now, first of all, I should say, you can't guard this anyway, but you know that this is coming. So, what are you going to do? Keep in mind, sometimes you can find the best move by knowing what your opponent wants to do. Your opponent wants to take this pawn. Very good, guys. It's king to g3. Hands down, you have to choose the move king to g3. Why? Your king is a fighting piece in the endgame. And if you allow this capture, your king would be forced to go backwards. Capablanca recognized that and says, okay, I'm going to play king to g3. You're going to take this pawn, but I'm going to get into your position via the king side. And after the move king to g3, Alekhine comments on this move. Not Reddy, Alekhine, world champion Alekhine. Alekhine says, decisive. White sacrifices material in order to obtain the classical position with the king on f6, and the pawn on g6 with the rook on the 7th rank, whereupon black's pawns tumble like ripe apples. That's what Alekhine says. So let's see those pawns tumble like ripe apples. And Reddy says, it's extremely instructive to see how Capablanca is no longer in the least concerned about material equality, but only thinks of supporting his passed pawn. And again, that is a testament, these great masters, that is a testament to the concept that activity in the endgame far outweighs material, especially this type of material that wasn't going to be useful much anyway. So king h4, here we go. Rook f3, pawn to g6. He loses another pawn, but his king gets into the game, and this is exactly what Alekhine was talking about when he made the analogy to tumbling like ripe apples, that black's pawns would tumble like ripe apples. First of all, checkmate's on the board, right? On top of that, the whole 7th rank is collapsing, and on top of that, you have a pawn about to promote. So here's Reddy, some of the final notes. Reddy says, it is a frequently available finesse in such positions not to capture hostile pawns, but to pass them in order to be protected in the rear against checks from the rook. So he's talking about this particular moment, that if you take this pawn, the rook comes down and checks you, and you can't actually set up threats against the black king, because by taking one of black's pawns, you're actually allowing him more activity as a distraction. So that's why king f6 was played by Capablanca. And again, that's why Reddy says it's frequently available finesse in such positions not to capture enemy pawns, but to pass them in order to be protected in the rear against checks from the rook, which is exactly what's happening here. White is hiding in front of the enemy pawn as to not be harassed by the rook from behind. So king to g8, rook g7, king h8, and the reason he inserted that is now after captures, there's a mate threat, the pawn is still having ideas, rook e8, king takes f5 now, okay, rook to e4, king back to f6. Now, the funny thing about taking that pawn is it probably would have been easier to go here. Okay, but he took the pawn. It all wins here. All roads lead to Athens here, so there's nothing much left. But it is nice to see all the pawns crumble. This is very interesting. So he's allowing this pawn to be captured, recognizing that the resulting pawn endgame is winning because white nurses the pawn to promotion by just getting out of the way. Black doesn't have any distraction here. So, of course, Tartakower doesn't go down so easily. Capablanca takes another pawn. And remember, I'm just going to do a flashback here. In this position, black is up 2 pawns. Fast forward, due to white's activity and white's threats. Fast forward to this position. In this position, white is up a pawn. So that's a 3-pawn swing from black being up 2 pawns to now black being down a pawn. It's a 3-pawn swing due to the activity of the pieces. And then, these are swinging down too. So we'll just breeze through the rest of the game here, but, Tartakower is just down too much material here. So this pawn's coming home, and so the great Tartakower resigned the game. Hi, I'm Peter Giannatos, founder of the Charlotte Chess Center. If you enjoyed these videos, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you'd like to watch these videos live, be sure to follow us on Twitch.